Saipan.
Edged towards the southern shores of Saipan.
June
The following day, the US Congress declared war.
1944. The jungle holds its breath. 3,000 Japanese soldiers crouch beneath the palms, hearts pounding as they watch American Marines stumble backward through the smoke. It looks like retreat, chaotic, desperate, final. Lieutenant Colonel Takashi Hyakushi grips his binoculars and shouts a single word that will seal their fate. Banzai! What follows is not a battle, but a trap so precise it rewrote the laws of warfare. This is no man's land, and tonight we're uncovering how the U.S. Marines turned a fake retreat into one of the deadliest ambushes in history. Subscribe for more stories they never told you in school. June 1944. The Pacific War had turned into a slow, grinding monster. Each island was another ring in the cage surrounding Japan, and Saipan sat at the very center of that cage. Barely 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, this volcanic outcrop wasn't just another target. It was the key to striking Japan's home islands. From Saipan, American B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach Tokyo for the first time. Whoever controlled Saipan controlled the war's future, and both sides knew it. The island itself was a nightmare. Rugged cliffs, jagged coral, and a choking jungle that swallowed men whole. The Japanese had spent months fortifying it, digging caves, tunneling through rock, turning every ridge into a fortress. More than 30,000 troops waited for the invasion under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, men hardened by years of warfare in China and the Pacific. Their orders were simple: die before surrender. To them, death in battle was not tragedy. It was transcendence. Across the sea, aboard the USS Rocky Mount, Marine Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith studied maps lit by red lamps. He knew what awaited his men: minefields, artillery hidden in cliffs, machine guns disguised as rocks. Direct assault would be suicide. But Smith had learned something from earlier campaigns on Guadalcanal and Tarawa. The Japanese weren't unpredictable. They were fanatically consistent. They followed the Bushido Code, a warrior creed that glorified attack and viewed retreat as shameful. They didn't just fight, they chased. That flaw was the spark of genius. If the Japanese couldn't resist charging when they smelled weakness, perhaps weakness could become the weapon. Smith's staff called it madness. He called it mathematics. The Marines wouldn't just fight on Saipan, they'd stage a retreat, make it look real enough to bait the enemy from their bunkers, and then annihilate them with pre-sighted artillery and naval fire. The idea was radical, even heretical. Every manual said, never yield ground. But Saipan wasn't a textbook. It was the throat of Japan's empire. And if turning retreat into deception could save thousands of American lives, then Smith was willing to risk it. The stage was set for one of the most audacious traps in modern military history, one that would leave the jungle soaked in blood and change warfare forever. In the humid war rooms aboard the USS Rocky Mount, the plan took shape under flickering lamplight. General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith gathered his staff and outlined what no military manual had ever dared to suggest: a controlled retreat designed to look like chaos. The Japanese would believe they were watching the Marines break, when in reality, they'd be stepping into a killing ground calculated down to the inch. The entire operation depended on one fragile illusion: fear. Marine officers debated it fiercely. "Sir, retreat goes against everything we've trained for," one colonel protested. Smith didn't argue. He just pointed to a map of Tarawa and said, "Then let's not die the same way twice." The room went silent. Everyone in that steel-walled chamber knew the stakes. A frontal assault would cost thousands. A deception, if it worked, could end the fight in one night. But if even one squad panicked for real, it would unravel into disaster. The planning was almost theatrical. Every Marine had a role. Riflemen would fall back in staggered waves, leaving behind rifles, helmets, and broken crates to sell the illusion of panic. Machine gunners and mortar teams would stay hidden behind ridge lines, waiting for the signal. Naval gunners aboard offshore destroyers spent nights calculating trajectories for artillery support that had to land within a 30-yard margin of error, too wide, and the enemy might escape, too short, and they'd kill their own men. Even the supposed abandoned artillery pieces were pre-sabotaged, barrels warped so they couldn't be used against the retreating Marines. Every movement was choreographed to appear unscripted. Soldiers rehearsed fake disorder, learning how to stumble believably, how to look terrified without losing formation. Radio operators created false distress chatter to sell the illusion further, while forward observers logged firing coordinates disguised as fallback routes. It was part battle plan, part stage play, and part psychological experiment, one that would test not just courage, but trust. The biggest challenge wasn't the Japanese, it was the human instinct to hold your ground. Marines were taught to fight forward, to never yield an inch. Now they were being ordered to act like cowards in front of an enemy that would show no mercy if they hesitated. But Smith reminded them of the larger truth. This wasn't about running. It was about baiting. "We'll make them believe we're broken," he told his officers, "and then we'll break them for real." By the time the invasion fleet neared Saipan's shores, every detail was locked in. Machine gun nests hidden beneath camouflage netting. Mortar crews waiting behind the second line. Naval fire control officers ready to rain steel on pre-sighted zones. Even medics rehearsed where to crawl when the deception started. It was an operation so risky that if the Japanese didn't take the bait, it could collapse into a massacre. Still, the Marines were ready. They'd learned to fight like mathematicians, and soon they'd learn how to weaponize panic itself. The landing began at first light on June 15, 1944. 8,000 Marines slammed into breakers and coral, dragging themselves up beaches hammered by artillery and machine gun nests. The sky smelled of cordite and salt. Men waded through surf slick with blood and oil, palms whipping like blind fists. Inch by inch, the Americans took the shore, but the island's interior was a different world. Volcanic ridges, razor coral, and tunnels bored into rock where Japanese defenders waited like coiled vipers. Progress turned to grind. Every yard cost lives. For 3 days, the advance crawled inland. Night brought the worst. Screaming counterattacks, desperate, fanatical assaults that tested even hardened Marines. The Japanese doctrine prized offense and shamed retreat. They would charge with bayonets flashing and bodies piled on one another like waves. Those attacks had broken units on other islands. Commander after commander had bled for every ridge. General Holland Smith watched the slow arithmetic of the battle and saw opportunity in pattern. The enemy chased perceived weakness. Intelligence reported concentrations near the Tonopag Plain. Radio intercepts hinted at an approaching coordinated counterstroke. On the afternoon of June 19th, the theater rehearsed itself. Orders slipped down the line in low voices. Begin withdrawal, controlled. Marines practiced the choreography in daylight. Fall back a pace, drop a crate, let a helmet roll, feign panic without breaking discipline. It was a dangerous theater. One misstep, and the performance became real. Forward observers marked coordinates behind the fake line. Sailors on cruisers ran numbers for firing solutions. Mortar crews camouflaged positions in the second tier. Every movement was timed in seconds. Across the ravine, Japanese watchers peered through binoculars and saw the scene their commanders craved. American soldiers stumbling, weapons abandoned, a beachhead appearing to unravel. Lieutenant Colonel Takashi Hayakushi read the signal the way any professional would. Retreat equals rout. Rout deserves pursuit. He ordered the counterattack. What followed was the predictable human calculus of war. Discipline giving way to momentum. The first formations held. Then they broke into a run. The chant rose, an old battle cry pushing men forward. That run was the trap's hinge. To the Japanese, it was victory in motion. To the Marines, it was the single beat they'd been counting their whole campaign for. The illusion of collapse had been sold perfectly. Now all that remained was to let the geometry of fire do what the stagecraft had invited: turn charge into slaughter. By dusk on June 19th, Saipan's jungle was breathing war. Heat shimmered off the volcanic ridges. Smoke hung low like fog, and the jungle's heartbeat quickened with every step of the Japanese advance. Lieutenant Colonel Hiyakushi's men surged forward, shouting their ancestral cry, "Banzai!" the word tearing through the humid air as thousands charged headlong into what they thought was retreating chaos. From their vantage, the Americans were finished, falling back in disarray, leaving behind wrecked artillery, ration boxes, even stretchers. The illusion was perfect. But behind that illusion lay geometry. Marine gunners had already ranged every ridge, every path, every patch of open ground. Hidden mortars sat buried under palm fronds, their coordinates etched into laminated cards. Spotters crouched in shell holes, radios pressed to their helmets, eyes locked on the line of advancing figures. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then a single whistle cut through the night. In an instant, the entire battlefield inverted. The retreating Marines dropped into the dirt, rifles aimed and fingers steady. Camouflage nets ripped away from Browning M1919 machine guns as synchronized bursts shredded the darkness. The jungle erupted into sound and light. Streams of tracers stitched through the charging masses like molten rain. Men who had screamed banzai seconds before were now silhouettes convulsing in firelight. Mortars fired next. Dozens of shells arced overhead, each one landing with mathematical precision in the densest clusters of attackers. The explosions rolled like thunder, turning the jungle floor into a storm of dirt, shrapnel, and torn bodies. Hayakushi tried to shout new orders, but his voice drowned under the chaos. His men could neither advance nor retreat. Behind them, artillery from naval destroyers began to pound the ridges, sealing every escape route in fire. On the USS Indianapolis offshore, spotters adjusted range dials as the ship's 8-inch guns thundered, sending 260-pound shells inland. Each impact flattened trees and flung men through the air like rag dolls. The once green valley became a flickering landscape of orange and black, flames licking at the edges of smoke-choked craters. Within minutes, the retreat had transformed into annihilation. Marines who had feigned panic now moved with ruthless efficiency, mowing down survivors, guiding artillery corrections, ensuring no gaps remained in the wall of death. The Japanese formations, so disciplined minutes earlier, collapsed into fragments of screaming confusion. The entire operation lasted less than 20 minutes. 18 minutes of choreographed violence, so exact it defied belief. By the time silence returned, the ground steamed from heat and blood. The Marines hadn't just survived. They'd rewritten the rules of modern ambush warfare. What began as deception ended as a massacre. And on that night in Saipan's jungle, the illusion of weakness became the deadliest strength mankind had ever engineered. What unfolded in those 18 minutes defied every notion of traditional combat. It wasn't battle, it was mathematics. A slaughter scripted by angles, timing, and pressure gauges. The first wave of Japanese troops never had a chance. Those in front disintegrated under intersecting lines of machine gun fire. Those behind tripped and stumbled over the fallen, creating bottlenecks that mortars exploited with merciless precision. Every explosion painted the jungle in bursts of orange and white. Heat so intense it seared the moisture from the air. Lieutenant Colonel Hyakushi staggered through the smoke, his face streaked with ash, binoculars still clenched in his hands. He shouted for order, but his command dissolved into noise. Men screaming, rifles clattering, limbs torn from bodies by artillery concussions. The doctrine of Bushido, of glorious death and fearless charge, met something it could never withstand. Cold, engineered inevitability. He finally saw it then. The perfectly spaced muzzle flashes, the symmetrical arcs of mortar bursts, the naval shells landing in neat intervals. It wasn't chaos. It was design. When Hyakushi fell moments later, struck by shrapnel from a naval round, his men's will crumbled. Some tried to crawl back toward their original lines, but the sea itself had turned hostile. Shells from the Indianapolis and New Orleans walked methodically up the valley, closing every exit. Others threw themselves into foxholes or tried to dig through volcanic rock with their hands. A few continued to charge, not from courage, but because there was nowhere left to go. Private Daniel Chen, crouched behind his radio, watched the line through trembling hands. He heard men screaming in Japanese, in English, in sounds that didn't belong to language. He relayed fire corrections with a voice that didn't sound like his own. 50 yards left, he whispered into the handset, eyes fixed on the glowing horizon. When the next barrage landed, he flinched, but didn't look away. The valley lit up again, a second sun rising and dying in seconds. When the firing finally stopped, silence wasn't relief. It was wrong. Smoke drifted over terrain that no longer resembled Earth. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of cordite and burned cloth. Across the kill zone, bodies lay in geometric patterns that mirrored the firing diagrams drawn days before. It was as if the landscape itself remembered the plan. Marines moved cautiously among the wreckage, bayonets fixed, expecting survivors or counterfire. There was none. The Japanese regiment that had begun the charge with 3,000 men was gone, obliterated in less than 20 minutes. Only a few dozen remained, many too wounded to speak, others too broken to comprehend what had happened. American casualties totaled 43. The ratio was staggering. 1 Marine dead for every 60 Japanese. But numbers couldn't quantify what the survivors felt as they looked out across the valley. Private Chen would later write in his notebook, "It wasn't war anymore. It was a machine that fed on men." That night, the jungle cooled, but the ground still smoked. Officers logged coordinates and casualty counts with the same precision that had created the ambush. The reports would call it a success. The men who survived called it something else entirely. 18 minutes in hell. By dawn, the valley was silent, except for the crackle of dying fires. Smoke drifted between the palms like fog, carrying the heavy smell of fuel, charred wood, and flesh. The sun rose red over Saipan, tinting everything in a sickly light that made the ground look alive. Marines stepped cautiously through what was left of the battlefield, rifles raised, though no enemy stirred. The jungle that had swallowed thousands of Japanese soldiers the night before now stood still, blackened, broken, and silent. General Holland Smith arrived just after sunrise. His jeep stopped at the ridge that overlooked the kill zone. From there, the destruction looked like geometry carved in ash. The densest piles of bodies lay in the exact center of the field, the heart of the trap, while smaller clusters marked the edges where a few men had tried to crawl away. Smith's operations officer noted the pattern out loud. "Sir, it's almost beautiful." Smith didn't reply. The word didn't belong there. Medics moved among the dead searching for survivors, though most Japanese soldiers had already made their choice. Many carried grenades clutched to their chests. Others had slashed their own throats rather than surrender. Those still breathing often refused water or morphine, choosing silence over capture. Marines hardened by years of combat found themselves shaken. "They weren't fighting anymore," one corporal whispered. "They were just gone." The official casualty report would later list approximately 2,800 Japanese dead or missing. American losses were 43 killed and a little over 100 wounded. The ratio was unprecedented, a perfect ambush on paper. But the numbers couldn't account for what it felt like to walk that valley. The mud was so thick with blood, it clung to boots like tar. The air buzzed with flies before noon. Private Daniel Chen, the young radio man, wandered in shock through the field he had helped destroy, his voice raw from calling fire missions. He counted neither victory nor vengeance, only the ringing in his ears and the blank faces staring up from the earth. When reporters asked General Smith for comment, he stared down at the scorched jungle and said simply, "We used their pride against them." Then he turned away. The statement appeared in newspapers as triumph. But to those who'd been there, it sounded like an epitaph. Not just for the enemy, but for something inside themselves. The trap at Saipan had worked perfectly, too perfectly. The victory at Saipan was decisive, but it didn't feel like one. For the Marines who survived, triumph came laced with nausea. In the days that followed, bulldozers moved through the valley, pushing thousands of bodies into mass graves. Chaplains murmured prayers over smoke and silence, while flies gathered in clouds so dense they looked like drifting shadows. Soldiers who had celebrated the night before now worked with blank faces, shoveling dirt over what had once been men. Some wept quietly. Most said nothing. The human mind had no compartment for what it had just witnessed. General Smith received medals and telegrams of commendation. His innovative tactical withdrawal, praised in Washington as a masterstroke of battlefield deception. But the reports sanitized everything. They spoke of efficiency, not agony, of numbers, not nightmares. In private letters to his wife, Smith's tone was different. "They call it clever," he wrote, "but cleverness is a poor word for making men die so predictably." Those words never reached the public eye. The fake retreat became legend almost overnight. Intelligence officers turned it into doctrine, rebranding the horror as Operation False Withdrawal. Training manuals dissected every detail: the timing, the spacing, the psychological manipulation. Diagrams of the kill zone appeared in classrooms at Quantico, where new officers traced the patterns of artillery fire as if studying choreography. On paper, it was perfect, the clean lines of military logic. In memory, it was a scar. For the men on the ground, ghosts came home with them. Private Daniel Chen's hands still trembled whenever he held a radio years later. He couldn't bear the sound of static. It reminded him of the fire missions, of coordinates whispered between screams. Other survivors reported waking up in the middle of the night to phantom explosions or the echo of that single whistle that had turned retreat into death. Some drank, some prayed, some never spoke of Saipan again. To historians, the ambush marked a turning point in Pacific warfare, the moment when deception and psychology replaced brute force as America's sharpest weapon. But to the men who'd been there, Saipan was proof of a darker truth: that war rewards those who can suppress their humanity the longest. The valley they left behind wasn't just a battlefield, it was a warning, a demonstration of how intelligence can become indistinguishable from cruelty once the numbers start to make sense. Saipan was won, but something in every man who fought there stayed lost. In the months after Saipan, the tactic that had begun as a desperate gamble evolved into standard operating procedure. Commanders across the Pacific studied the battle's reports with the reverence usually reserved for scripture. The phrase "controlled withdrawal" entered Marine vocabulary, its meaning both brilliant and sinister. At Tinian, it was repeated. At Peleliu, refined. By Okinawa, it had become art, an invisible snare laid not with barbed wire, but with human psychology. Even as Japanese commanders learned of the trap, they couldn't resist it. Cultural conditioning was stronger than caution. To them, retreat was dishonor, a personal failure that demanded immediate redress through attack. American strategists exploited that instinct mercilessly. Every apparent weakness was bait, every movement calculated to manipulate the opponent's sense of pride. What Sun Tzu had written 2,000 years earlier, feign disorder and strike him, was reborn through radio frequencies, pre-sighted artillery grids, and naval coordination. The ancient deceit of the false retreat had found its modern, mechanized form. But victory carried a price no statistic could measure. The Marines who had lived through Saipan returned home to parades, medals, and hollow applause. Some smiled for the cameras, others stared through them. The official records called it a tactical masterpiece. The veterans called it the night the jungle screamed. They couldn't shake the smell of burnt earth, or the sight of men running toward death believing they'd found glory. For them, Saipan was no legend. It was a wound that never fully healed. By the war's end, the lessons of deception had spread beyond the Pacific. Military academies in both the East and West dissected Saipan as proof that understanding your enemy's mind was as lethal as any weapon. The United States had proven that fear and pride could be engineered like ammunition. Yet within that triumph lay a paradox. The more efficient war became, the less human it felt. Today, Saipan's jungle has reclaimed the valley. Vines drape over rusted helmets, and the wind hums softly through shell holes that once roared with fire. Tourists walk the ground where 2,800 men died in 18 minutes, unaware they tread on a graveyard shaped by intellect, not rage. Plaques describe the strategy, not the screams. In the end, the fake retreat wasn't just a maneuver, it was a mirror. It showed how far mankind would go to outthink its own morality. The Americans won Saipan, yes, but beneath the victory, something fundamental was lost: the belief that war could still have honor. When the jungle breathed again, it exhaled smoke and silence, and the ghosts of 3,000 men who ran toward what they thought was triumph, never knowing they were already inside the jaws of genius.